Because now that I've been part of this institute, I've realized how all the practices that we've learned about have centered on literacy. So I went back to the lesson plans that I had initially created, and I thought, well, all the examples that I searched for and try to find, I could plug in the examples that we have learned about throughout these 4 weeks. So these are the objectives that have been given to me. The ones that are bolded are the ones that I'm currently focusing on. But basically, what I'm supposed to do, I'm supposed to teach students what literacy is. They're supposed to examine what role literacy plays in their lives. They're supposed to investigate the literacy practices of a professional or someone in academia, and then they're supposed to reflect on everything that they've learned, and as a culminating activity, they're supposed to create a multimodal project. So all these pictures around here, hopefully by the end of the semester, I hope that my students can recognize that in one way or another, all these involve literacy. And I would explain them more in detail, but I know I'm going to run out of time. So these are the 4 units that I'm going to work with throughout the semester. And I'm going to go through each one, tell you what the objective of each one is, and then tell you how I anticipate in helping students learn about their own literacies using a Mesoamerican context. So the last one, the multimodal project, because I don't think I'll get to that point, I just want to explain to you that multimodalities are either compositions or messages that are conveyed using more than one form of communication. So for example, spoken word mixed in with performance. So like Mare's performance would be a multimodality. So for Unit 1, students are supposed to compose a literacy narrative. And what I wanted to do, I wanted to introduce various literacies to my students. So I went with Juana, and we went to the same Alebrije taller, and we met Benito Ortega's son, the Alebrije maker. So on the left-hand side, you see Benito Ortega. He explained to us his craft. He was very detailed, very articulate. But then when I met his son, what struck me while he was performing La Danza de las Plumas, surrounded by all these alebrijes, was this absorption of his culture. Like he was absorbing everything around him, and that led me to start thinking about what his literacy is going to be, and how his literacy is going to be influenced by his familial traditions, by his cultural traditions. I also want to introduce to my students the Luis and Anita's art, the messages that are conveyed through their art by their use of the amate paper. I also want to introduce the woman who communicates through whistling and pose questions to my students such as how are different literacies categorized? What is a dominant literacy versus a non-dominant one? Which leads me to the third source that I want to introduce to my students. So Gloria Anzaldúa, Chicana theorist, she has her seminal work, Borderlands. Usually the last chapter is the one that's anthologized, Towards a New Mestiza Consciousness. But the chapter that really speaks volumes to me is her chapter on language. It's titled How to Tame a Wild Tongue. And I remember the first time I read that chapter, I was so moved that finally someone empowered me, because my primary language is not considered a dominant language. So I grew up speaking Spanglish. Anzaldúa describes it as Chicano Spanish. But growing up speaking Spanglish and the criticism that I get from people who probably grew up speaking Spanish and then become bilingual and grow up English or vice versa, there is that struggle for Spanglish to be recognized as a dominant language. So coming from La Frontera, that way of being is reflected in that language. So when I read that chapter, I felt so empowered. So I recommend that source to you. Your students don't have to be learning Spanish or learning English. As long as they're bilingual speakers or are struggling with identity, that chapter will really make them feel empowered. For Unit 2, students are supposed to investigate the academic literacies of a professional or someone in academia. So, Bob was gracious enough to grant me an interview, and so he and I had a dialogue about his literacy practices, and we also talked about how his personal interests can somehow contribute to the academic skills that he builds. And that's something that I'm going to encourage my students to do, to look at the professionals that they're going to interview and try to find connections between that professional, their lives, their personal interests, and how that connects and influences their academic lives. I also want to have them investigate the professional practices of others through observation. So I'll probably show them snippets of Dr. Swanton's lecture, and with a handout guide them through what they should be looking for as they observe academics or professionals in their practicing their profession. And ultimately, the objective for that unit is for them to learn how personal interests influence academic literacies. And then for Unit 3, they have to compose a case study. And in their case study, they need to build an awareness of audience. So they're going to really look at how someone who produces a text, how they're conveying a message to a targeted audience, but also what kind of message is conveyed to people that they didn't imagine reading that text. So they can either look at a blog, or they can look at a short text message, they can look at a billboard message. So it doesn't have to be a lengthy piece. It's just an assignment to help them become aware of the audience that they're writing for, but also what other messages are conveyed to people that they didn't intend would receive that message. But one thing I want to do in this unit is introduce to them a text that I love and I adore, and that I've spoken to some of you about. It's called the Codex Expandiensis, from Columbus to the Border Patrol. And it is a collaborative project written by Guillermo Gomez Peña, Enrique Chagoya, and Felicia Rice. It was originally published, the first one was published on Amate paper. It folds out like a codices. It can be read from back to front to back, but the imagery, the art that is incorporated in there is highly influenced by Chicano issues. There is a number of poems by Guillermo Gomez Peña, and he also uses Spanglish. So if you're interested in the codices, I highly recommend this book. But it also is an example of a multimodal composition. So these authors are conveying a message through the use of the visual and through the use of different languages, so their use of Spanglish along with text. So that's something that I hope that you can take away from and explore further. And then finally, I don't think I have time for that. So selfishly, I'll introduce to my students the artwork that I own in my own work, and we'll talk about visual representation and what meaning visual brings into compositions. But then I'll work towards showing them different types of multimodal messages. So all these are multimodalities that I learned from these past 4 weeks. So hopefully my students will be influenced by these products and create something that will showcase what they learned throughout the semester, but also reflect their own literacy practices.